morning to everybody. My name is Steve Maddox. I'm the health sector leader at Cundall and a partner in the Manchester office. Thank you for joining us on our panel discussion this morning. This is the 16th event we've held since lockdown began. We've had thousands of attendees and over 3,000 plus YouTube views. We are, as Bianca said at the start, for those who had not joined us then, we are recording this event and it will be on the Cundall Global YouTube channel in a couple of days' time. We normally do thought leadership events like this face to face, but obviously it's a little bit prohibitive at the moment. Our panel this morning, I want to really thank them for taking the time out of their busy days, and I know Rosemary's got to shoot off at 9 o'clock, so we're going to get started straight away. We pulled together a team of people, and I think Duncan Cox in our Newcastle office has helped steer all this and told me to get on with it, so thank you very much for that, Duncan. We have somebody from policy and influencing level, Mike Ralph, who's a principal engineer and senior policy lead at NHS England and NHS Improvement. Mike's a chartered engineer, mechanical engineer and fellow of the IMechE and IHEAM, and has been head of healthcare engineering for Sodexo and has been working on some of the new publications and documents. From the sharp end, the person who has to deliver this at a local level, we have James Dixon from the Newcastle upon Tyne Hospital's NHS Foundation Trust. James is a chartered environmentalist and fellow of the Institute of Environmental Management and Assessment. He has 15 years environmental sustainability experience, including his role at Newcastle City Council. And he's been instrumental in helping Newcastle hospitals, leading to them become the first healthcare organisation in the world to publicly declare a climate emergency and commit to fast-tracking their decarbonisation efforts. And then from a design and implementation and representing both designers and partnering contractors on Procure 22, we have Rosemary Jensen from Jensen Architects. She's a healthcare architect by practice with over, it says 20 plus years, or probably a bit more, but I won't embarrass you, Rosemary, by saying any more, delivering a lot of exemplar healthcare winning awards. And because you've now become an independent architect, you're getting more work than I think you'd probably planned to when you went independent, working alongside a lot of the P22 contractors and looking at efficiency, productivity, repeatable room situations and so on. And our final guest is our own Cayman McCabe from Cundall Melbourne office. And it's early evening there. It's not that we've just run out of power. Cayman is an environmental sustainable design consultant. He's leading the ESD design team in Melbourne. And through his building services design background, Cayman has gained a wealth of knowledge of how buildings actually perform. And with this understanding of the performance of buildings, he's led the sustainable design solutions for numerous healthcare projects. Just a brief introduction on Cundall. Low carbon design has been in our DNA since the beginning of the business, which was formed by 5 engineers in 1976 and now is just over shy of 1,000 people in 22 offices across Europe, MENA, Asia Pacific and Australia, and delivering projects in over 50 countries. Our founding partner, Jeff Cundall, was the partner that led the Department of Health Low Energy Hospital at Wansbeck that was designed back in the late 80s and was awarded the Sunday Times Green Building of the Year in 1994 before thermal modelling, parametric analysis and Revit became the design tools of the day. It was traditional drawing board and calculator stuff, I think slide rules even in some of the situations. I revisited Wansbeck back in 2009 and compared it against the building regulations that were in force at the time of the design. And if we teleported it back to what was the 2009 regulations and compared to Passive House, the reductions that were achieved on that design were comparable. So it's fair to say, I think, loosely, that it was actually a Passive House low energy design. So it was doable in the 80s and in the 90s. It's doable now, funding permitted in brackets. And the purpose of today is we've always looked at HBNs and HTMs to direct us and look at design compliance. And it's how guidance is keeping track of this ever-changing regulatory and social landscape that we're going to chat about today. So without further ado, we have the Q&A. We've got 3 questions already come through this morning and a couple yesterday, which we'll try and get onto. Really, to start off with Mike, we talked about the NHS Sustainable Development Unit, and they issued a call for evidence between January and March this year and received over 600 responses for a greener NHS. Will it have the powers to implement change? They've published lots of data through the SDU on their website. I'm just wondering where they sit within the framework and what you're doing at policy level with NHSE, Mike.
Well, I mean, it define power. I mean, no, it's not going to be standard, statutory and mandatory to do these things. Although there is, there is other government legislation which may be. I think everybody's, the environment is one of the key things sort of going forward. And I think besides health, it's intuitive that the two do the right things. Now, the management and sort of guidance has always been good on hospitals and what we do, because we're very intensive in the services we use. And there was a lot of people that said that just what hospitals do makes them not sustainable. No matter what you do, you've got a lot of single use, a lot of things that you do. Now that's been challenged. We've seen it sort of in North America and Canada. They've done an awful lot of research work onto it. And again, the process of the HBNs and HTMs being reviewed is a lot slower, I think, than everybody would like, but that's been recognised. And with the latest push for building designs and the new HIT 1 and HIT 2 schemes coming up, that is all being reviewed, and all the documents that are going to be coming out are based on the net zero carbon philosophy, and we'll follow that. SDU really is looking to set the key parameters and policies for how all healthcare is delivered. And how we do it, and they are looking at the sort of the much bigger inclusive questions about sort of do you travel to a hospital, or does a hospital come to you, sort of thing? Do we use virtual hospitals? Do we cut out sort of the transport aspects and much more fundamental policy decisions? Plus the key elements about what fuels are we going to use, what anaesthetics are we going to use, what nebulizers are we going to use. They're very key to that you just play around the edges unless you actually really start sort of making see changes in things, and that's really what SDU's looking to do. In the past, I know, but bear in mind I don't work for SDU, and I'm sort of not sort of representing them, but they have done an awful lot of good work, but it's actually what real change on the ground that's made has been criticised, and I think we will see that changing, and there's going to be a lot more technical backup and leadership behind what they're doing and where they're going.
I think that's really interesting, because there is an awful lot of data that's on their website, and I know when we spoke last week about HTMO 301 draft that came out at the beginning of the year, I couldn't find the reference to net zero carbon, and Rosemary, you've pointed out that there's an introductory element that's coming forward on the new guidance. You're on mute, by the way, Rosemary.
Mute myself, thank you.
Yeah, that's all right.
Stephen's right. Obviously, there's been a sort of an overlap really with the announcements at the end of the year and the beginning of this around net zero carbon, and also the drafting and the updates to certain HBNs and HTMs. There's now been a standard introduction agreed that will go into all of the updates to the HBNs and HTMs in reference to net zero carbon, and obviously in terms of, as Mike's mentioned, prioritising some of the next wave of HBNs and HTMs which focus on that around sustainability and building on that work that's been done. So it will be embedded within the new documents as they come out.
I think as we discussed, we've all seen that the health building notes and the health technical memorandums are the de facto Bible that we follow. They're the rule book, and ye gods, anybody that tries to challenge them. From what we've discussed previously, I think there's going to be I wouldn't say a greater give or take, but there's more opportunity, I believe, going forward in terms of being able to challenge those and come up with justifiable variations to those. And I think James, as somebody who's, as I said at the introduction, somebody at the sharp end, you've got people above you within the trust exec board who perhaps have a different view on compliance and is strict adherence to the codes sort of mandated to you at your level?
I think HTMs and HBNs have been the Bibles of design, certainly from my experience. I'm not a designer or a project manager, but the projects that the capital projects team have been working on in the past, certainly that's the go-to. But from our point of view, our leadership team declared a climate emergency. You know, we're in the middle of a climate crisis. We're heading for 3 or 4 degrees increase in global warming temperatures from the industrial average. So there's an acceptance from our leadership team that we need to invest time and money in this. And if that means working with our experts and our authorizing engineers to challenge some of the accepted elements of HTMs, then we'd like to think we could. And there's really the discussions we've had at the early stages are about still achieving the outcomes that you're after. So if you're engaging with infection control and microbiology colleagues, you want to ensure you've got safe water and safe air at the end of it. The HTMs are there showing how you might achieve that and how it's been shown to do that, but we could implement other systems of, you know, dynamic air control. We've seen it, Mike's touched on it in other parts of the world where you know, we've been able to still achieve the clean air that we need, and also water temperatures. You know, there's innovative treatments out there that we could lower temperature and lower the energy needed while still achieving safe water. So we can work with people to try and create the hospitals of the future that will still be safe and ultimately zero carbon.
And I think, Mike, as we've spoken previously, we are tending to look at the built environment because that's what we are as specialists. But within NHS England and NHS Improvement, it is just one part of the whole sustainable equation, isn't it? I mean, we've already had a couple of questions relating to how do you change the embedded culture of organisations and their staff. One source of a hospital's carbon footprint is the travel of patients to and from the hospital site. For me, a big step would be a genuine move to appropriate remote working, as well as community-based face-to-face and diagnostic clinics. Has there been any work on the feasibility or the good examples of how this has been done? So it is a wider context than just the built environment.
In lots of ways, I mean, the STU really is looking at lifestyle and culture, and certainly, you know, that they say about sort of phones being indispensable, but a lot of these virtual clinics will be about apps that are on the phones that can actually give you an electrocardiogram. So if you've got one of these Fitbit watches or whatever they are, you know, you can wear that and you can tune in, and a clinician can sort of, you know, analyze your heart rate and your blood pressure, etc., from sort of, you know, 30 miles away. So the ability, I mean, very, very useful in lockdown as we are today, but I mean, you know, a little bit behind the curve there. But I mean, that's where we're going. So a lot of routine things, when you get into triage, you're not just going to be telling the doctor that you've got a sore throat or, you know, etc. They're going to be able to take your temperature, you know, your blood pressure, your heart rate, any sort of, you know, rhythmic problems. They're going to be able to check that as they're talking to you. So that will, you know, change a lot of the patterns of how we deliver healthcare, and that's, you know, one of the big changes. I mean, I'm looking at the chat box. I see Matt Gopal's on from Sage, and, you know, talking about anaesthetics and sort of nebulizers, and again, that's, you know, a huge area which people don't sort of particularly look at, and it's, you know, not only do you don't need all the an LEV system that's actually, you know, just sucking something that you probably don't really want in the first place, but, you know, with sort of like harvested anaesthetics and inhalationary agents, you're taking out huge sort of quantities of ozone depleting, you know, chemicals, and you know, you're making, and it's better for the patient, better for the clinicians, and better for the environment. So that's sort of the key, you know, major figures that SDU are driving on.
I mean, from my perspective, Stephen, it's absolutely about behavioural change. And that's across the board, because we've all got a responsibility to support delivery of net zero carbon, and the built environment is just one element of that. But if people within those buildings don't behave in appropriate ways or use them in that way, then we're not really going to achieve net zero carbon. So I think there's a whole number of initiatives that are overlapped. I think we've got 19 minutes in and we haven't mentioned COVID yet, but that's been a big accelerator. Not only in terms of the guidance and the documents, but also in terms of people's behaviours and expectations, the acceleration of digitisation and using technology. So there have been step changes that we should be able to embrace and use to our benefit moving forward in targeting at least net zero carbon.
I can speak from first hand, having gone to my GPs with a slightly dodgy ticker and then being told to lie down, and they put a scanner on me, emailed the the result to a remote cardiologist. Within 5 minutes, I was told I had to go off for 2 weeks rest because I had an irregular heartbeat, which was quite frightening within 5 minutes of walking into the doctor's surgery. So that sort of telemedicine is real and is happening. I can just bring Cayman into the equation, and somebody's just asked for a sort of if we can try and use fewer acronyms. The health building notes, which, you know, the building design guides and the health technical memoranda, those technical bulletins, engineering-based design guides, although they do cover the detail of things like sanitary ware, ceilings, and I suppose the baseline specification for a UK hospital. How do these things compare with yourselves in Australia, Cayman?
We also have them, but we don't necessarily call them HTMs or and so on, but the technical guidelines, etc., that exist. I suppose they set the minimum expectations that are there. What we've found, I suppose, is that we've actually, in Australia, we have unfortunately a lot of number of states and territories, and each one will actually have their own versions of the same thing. So we don't have a standard set of rules across the country. So you do have to remember where you are, not just even though you're in the same country. And then secondly, I suppose we found that actually following on from the UK, we've actually embraced the idea of PPPs, public-private partnerships. I believe they're called PFIs, or public funded initiatives. I'm not sure exactly what the acronym is in the UK. And that's allowed designs to just challenge or embrace advancements that have gone in. Generally, their changes have been allowed to those based on evidence-based design. And that's been actually quite instrumental in, I suppose, improving some of the healthcare outcomes and actually embracing changes, which there has actually been a considerable amount of, not just in treatments, but also in building technologies as well.
And I think we've learned a lot, and a lot of the ideas that you've been implementing in Australia with yourself and Dave Clark is because you've recognised Australia's been, energy-wise, a very poor generator of electricity and very unclean. The UK has made some massive inroads in the last couple of years in decarbonising its grid, which has changed the whole focus of the way we deliver healthcare, or is changing it. I think certainly from this year, the sort of energy strategies that we will be considering for new hospitals will be significantly different to previous ones. And I just wondering if there's some examples you can provide from Australia, Cayman.
Well, I suppose we don't have a same focus on net zero as the UK has. I won't get into a party political podcast as to which party says what. Essentially, we don't really have a national energy strategy, so it's largely left to the states and territories to decide what exactly they want to do and how fast they want to do it. South Australia is moving at a greater pace than other states and so on. So, but what we do have, which I think is actually brings to bear some of the comments that have been made already about the making it a joint problem to solve, is the fact that we have got a rating system called NABERS, which basically rates your performance in actual operation from a greenhouse gas emission perspective. You've called in the UK Design for Performance. We actually have NABERS Energy for hospitals, so that's starting to be used as a driver to ensure that the hospitals that are being built actually meet at least a minimum performance outcome. And then I suppose on top of that, we're actually being asked to do life cycle assessments to look at the embodied energy of things. Quite different from some of the other NABERS energy tools. NABERS Hospital is whole building, so it's not just about the facility management of the hospital, it's actually about the operation of the hospital. So that's starting to change things, refocus the mind and actually get people working together to solve the problem, as opposed to that kind of idea of the landlord-tenant approach. We do deliver things by PPP, so that tends to be the mindset. We're trying to break that down, and it's been great.
And I think that we could probably learn, we will, not no probable about it, we will be able to learn from those energy data, because as we've said, delivery of healthcare is the same, at the sharp end, at trust level, and how people, we all have similar illnesses and conditions that need dealing with. So if we can get some of that data, I think the UK built environment sector has been particularly poor at post-occupancy evaluation. The health service does have the ERIC returns, the estate return information. I can't remember what the C stands for, Mike. And say again, sorry.
Is estate's return information collection.
And that, for those who have not come across that, is an annual data return for energy consumption and lots of other statistics. I worked in the NHS in the early 90s. 1,000 metres that way from where I'm currently sat at the birthplace of the NHS, so it is very close to my heart as I'm sitting near Trafford General Hospital. And we used to do the ERIC returns, and I know from the speed that we used to run around the hospital and check measurements, they're probably more accurate now with BMS and metering. But that brings me on to another question in relation to, we need that post-occupancy data to be able to improve what we're doing moving forward. James, again, from the delivery end, we've seen lots of funding debates, and we're trying to avoid the political debate this morning because it changes every time Boris changes his son's nappy. We've got budgets that are being thrown around, debts being written off, we've got the HIP schemes that are coming forward, but there is still £6.5 billion of backlog maintenance. So how do you, as a person at a trust, implement, what's your priority target now? If you were to sort of list, your top numbers, is it CO2, is it carbon, is it travel? What are your priorities at the moment at a trust level?
From a sustainability point of view, Steve, difficult. I think we've declared a climate emergency and committed to decarbonisation as fast as possible. So if you take that in isolation, then we would be focusing on all of our direct emissions, which are 99.9% building energy related, because we've got a very small fleet. And we've already touched on the anaesthetic gases and other F gases. So, but our SHINE initiative, Sustainable Healthcare Newcastle, covers all aspects of sustainability. It's a broad brush, so we need to focus on travel, procurement, the embodied carbon, and our indirect emissions as well. But to answer the question, what we're focusing on is reducing demand in all areas. So energy demand, it's a no-brainer. This is old science to a lot of people on the call. If you can bring your demand down as much as possible, reduce waste, both on heat, electricity, transport. So we touched on COVID-19 earlier on, reducing the need for patients to actually come to a city centre acute hospital and deliver some remote consultations is saving patient time as well as reducing environmental impact. So demand reduction, number one priority. And then if you use it in the context of buildings for building energy, then that gives you the opportunity to move to low and zero carbon technologies when you've brought that demand down to a manageable level. So a big acute hospital with a combined heat and power plant that's gas fired, which is ours on our both hospital sites, that's a very different medium to decarbonize your heat. You can't naturally move to something that's off the shelf. Hydrogen's in the mix there, but until we get it piped around the network in the UK, it's going to be very, very difficult to deliver that kind of decarbonized heat on that level. So lower demand, number one priority, low and zero carbon technologies, and then offset potentially. We're not going to be able to completely drop all of our emissions to zero. So there'll be an element of do we offset locally with carbon sequestration and tree planting that we can potentially link with healthcare, social prescribing, patient access, benefit to the local health economy. So these are the kinds of things we're thinking of.
It's interesting you mentioned the hydrogen economy. I was looking at this last year for a client who was wanting to develop a tract of land to put houses, schools, community hospital, clinics, etc. And I discovered that Catapult Energy Systems, a government initiative, have commissioned some studies on hydrogen, and there were some pilot region studies done. So if there are any of the people, the 198 people on the call today, if you go to Catapult Energy Systems, there's some really useful documents. But yesterday I noted that Keele University for the last 6 months they've converted all their estate, 130 buildings, to run on 20% hydrogen. And whilst the first 6 months of the trial have been through this pandemic, they have posted successful results. And I know Worcester Bosch and the trade are looking at having all their kit ready for from 2025, the boilers will be ready. And I know our transport consultancy team believe that the switch to electricity is an interim measure, and that the hydrogen economy will come round as a bigger opportunity. That's an interesting one going forward, because we are 30 years away from the 2050 deadlines, and I've been doing this for nearly 40 years, and when you're getting old, when you're refurbishing buildings or knocking buildings down that you designed first time as an apprentice. So I think there is a pace of change to what we're going to be doing, and we want manufacturers to come up with some new ideas as well as ourselves. One thing I'd put on here is
on that. I mean, I think there's been one of the questions there raised was the idea of this kind of whole of building solution approach rather than the kind of cherry picking things. And I suppose having just completed a PPP here in Melbourne for a brand new hospital, $1.6 billion. And one of the solutions I came up with was actually a technology that allowed us to actually use the single-use plastics to convert it into an oil to actually run in a generator to generate electricity for the hospital. And scarily, the analysis actually suggested that there potentially was enough single-use plastic to run the hospital.
It's interesting because, Mike, you mentioned when we were talking about the aspects of sustainability, and as I said at the beginning, we focus on built environment, but from an NHS policy level, there's that potentially is just landfill waste. So there is some element of potential there, isn't there?
Well, I mean, certainly one of the. I mean, I'm looking through the questions from people. There's a lot of sort of cross-covering questions. A lot of the PPE that we'll now be looking at will be reusable rather than single use. It's purely it's where we are and how we're trying to get it. But as you become more of an entrenched situation with CV19, I mean, that certainly the reuse of things is being definitely looked at. And I'll pick a lot of the questions up here. I think steam will always be around for decontamination because it's just so good at it. I mean, I've brought up with steam. I'm a great fan of it, but producing it is not the most energy. It's the best fluid medium for transferring energy, but it's not always the best to produce with low carbon technologies. But yes, steam will always be around. I see there's a couple in there. That's Fergus saying about derogations. I mean, let's not have derogations as sort of, the HGMs can be used as handcuffs in some ways, and they stifle some innovation. So what we're trying to do going forward, and from a policy perspective, is that, there's this argument, are they, best practice or minimum standards? Well, they're a guide. They're that. And if you can do something sort of, equal or better, and with less energy, less cost, something like, we want people to do that. And that's the whole ethos of them going forward. So there are going to be processes that are going to be in for the hospital improvement plan development schemes coming forward, so that we do innovate and we do try and move forward. Because if we don't, I mean, that's why lots of things you see in hospitals have been the same for a long time, because it can, if we're not careful, stifle innovation beyond what technology is changing.
I think that's what feedback. I think that's what Rosemary said the other day. We have been. I'm not sure what the adjective or the description, but we've almost bowed down to the Bible and feel that we daren't cross it. And there are some people, let's be honest, who are, they beat up designers, they beat up contractors and say, you're not compliant. And I think, Rosemary, you said the other day that providing a reason, well, I'll let you use the words that you came up with last week, because you were more eloquent than I was.
I think there are a couple of points to say really. One is responding to your comment about post-occupancy evaluations. Obviously, we've spent a lot of time in the framework now standardising post-occupancy evaluations across the government soft landing measures, capturing social, environmental and financial, as well as staff, patient and service outcomes. So we are getting better at the post-occupancy evaluation and understanding our baseline in terms of where we are to inform designs moving forward. We're also getting better at actually tracking the derogations and the common derogations, so we can begin to learn from those actually assess the risk and the impact of those in use, and begin to use that capturing. So NHS E&I have now published a standard approach to derogations that they can actually track and monitor those to feed them back into the guidance as the guidance gets updated. So the intention at the moment, we're still, in the stage where we have sort of PDF documents, but there is a move to a more agile system so that we can not only ensure that the documents are up to date and representing the best practice that we know about, but we're also getting better at communicating innovations and sharing those nationally so that everyone can benefit from those. And those, I've seen a couple of comments, sometimes they can be small changes that have a significant impact. Others, when we're talking about a construction development, will have more material benefits. So we are moving in the right direction, but I do think we need to recognise that there are a number of different aspects, and the net zero carbon is probably one of 5, I guess, ministerial priorities at the moment in terms of the construction industry and public sector buildings. So we are getting better at it. We're getting better at capturing the information and then using it intelligently to inform our designs as we move forward.
And I think that's interesting that you mentioned about the small elements. There's a really interesting article in June's Health Estate Journal, which is the IHEM journal, by a chap called Stephen Lowndes from the from Technology and Carbon Energy Fund, and he's written an article about carbon energy savings, and he said there's no silver bullet that's going to do this. And I liken it to the British cycling squad. They were way down in the world order of cycling quality and wins, and they set up the Department of Small Gains in Manchester, and they set people to look at specific tasks, from aerodynamics to nutrition of the athletes to strength of the bikes and so on, and they looked at percentages improvements on each element, and those small elements created a much greater impact. And I think that's where we need to look at going forward. And one of the things that I found I was very, very involved a number of years ago in the pilot regions for Pure 21, I think it was called then, Pure 21 Plus. And we had NHS estates that we talked to with, they published documents. And then that name disappeared. And you mentioned about this information that's coming to market, about how this information is going to be more public. And it's been interesting to see, at the moment, you look at NHS estates and you just go on .gov.uk and trying to find it through the search engine, you put a term in, you get 30,000 responses. So I'm just wondering if Mike and Rosemary, how that's going to help the industry weave its way through this minefield.
NHS estates doesn't exist as such anymore, and it's almost like you can't use the NHS word. We've had something, we obviously didn't need it and got rid of it, because I've been part of both, you see, and you can't use the E word back at Skipton House. That's my personal view, obviously not represented by sort of NHS or I. I think, but what we're all getting away from is it's people's personal responsibility. And I mean, I find that people, they always want somebody else to sign it off and be a permission sort of, it's that, to be given permission. And certainly when I was executive director at Great Ormond Street, I put in a copper silver ionisation system to reduce water temperatures, and I put in ammonia refrigeration. And they were both things that sort of, as I've moved on and gone to do other things, people have panicked about it because they want somebody to be responsible for it. Now, I'm a professional chartered engineer, and I make decisions on what I see, in front of me, and evidence that's worked. And I don't see why people wouldn't want to do that. But I remember at the time doing the water through NHS estates, as it was at the time, with Chris Holm, and I had many a conversation with Chris about sort of doing it. And he said, well, ultimately, the line is that it's not a preferred way of doing it. Yeah, went and did it. It's been there for about 8 or 9 years now, I think. It works, and it's reduced the temperature, and it's reduced the energy, which was only one of the many advantages of doing it. But the reality, there are still no other hospitals that have followed it, and no one is prepared to sort of take the risk and their PI or their sort of their standing in the community by doing it again. And it's ionisation is old technology now.
Yeah.
It's got a lot better in how it works, but the principle is back to the Romans. And certainly over the last sort of 30 years, it's been very widely used. but we're still all heating water up to much hotter than it needs to be, and then having to sort of cool it down before we can use it again.
And I think
it just doesn't make sense.
With that particular one, we've been talking about that internally in the business, and one thing you have to consider is the ongoing capex, opex, the maintenance, monthly visits, etc. So as long as you go in with your eyes wide open into something with the impacts, then that's very funny. You're saying it's. But
believe me, it's less. I mean, yeah. The thing is, people don't. They don't. Very few places I've found maintain their thermostatic mixing valves to DO8 standards. And if you're actually doing that, that's an expensive process to do the sort of test and to replace the sort of parts and that as you need to, if indeed you can even get into these clinical areas and do it. So, the thermostatic mixing valve is like a PPE element in it. And again, you're putting that PPE in there because you've heated the water up to hotter than you really want it, and it really needs to be just to do things.
There was one question that came up. I'm just going to try and find it from somebody. It was a specific one for James about where's it gone?
It's probably gone, Stephen, because I've answered it. If
have you?
Over. Yeah.
Oh, right, okay.
I've answered it for Jonathan, so everyone should be able to see the answer as well. But it was about the impact of us declaring and have staff bought in and.
Oh, okay. Could you expand on that for those who like me didn't figure out you could actually go onto the answer box as well, because I'm a bit new on all this too. What the culture being at your trust at staff level?
Well, I joined over 10 years ago now, so it's been an overnight success of 10 years in the making. But since I arrived, there's always been support for action on sustainability. We've built up a network of over 300 green champions in the trust, and they advocate for change in their areas and the wards and departments. So I think in a nutshell, we've done a lot of work from the grassroots up. And I've seen the appetite in the workforce, clinical workforce, estates workforce for a number of years. I think my own personal journey was, the IPCC report coming out in 2018, showing the stark reality of, where we're going to be in 10 years now, is truly terrifying. And I wanted to do something about it. So rather than the grassroots support, I wanted to really lobby for our board to take it seriously. Climate emergency wasn't a thing when I was starting with that bit of work, but it came about with a lot of the local authorities declaring. So it was just a hook that we used to get them to declare that they were going to take it seriously. And since declare, sorry, Stephen.
No, go on, carry on.
And since declaring, that was just almost a passion project for me to make sure we could get that level of support. And I didn't really foresee what that level of support would be. You guess you put business cases forward with the environmental impact, and that would be taken a bit more seriously if you get that support. But in the agenda that we're on today, I used to be the crazy going into project meetings trying to push for sustainability and BREEAM outstanding, and can we get close to passive house levels of energy demand, and it was there at the beginning. It was all great. I was almost appeased, and then further down the line, value engineering, you name it, we can't afford that extra million, James, you're not going to get it. That completely changed, because if you've got CEO and top level support that this is the right thing to do, and we need to lead by example, and we shouldn't be locking in carbon into these buildings that we're going to be sweating assets for 60, 70 years, then that is nailed into the design principles, and that's what we've got to try and achieve. And us putting our head above the parapet as the first trust to publicly declare, our CEO and board want us to deliver on this. So there's that extra bit of impetus. So certainly my experience, it's been transformational.
And I think that's the difference between now and, say, the 70s and the 80s, when there was the energy efficiency drives. I remember in the 70s where you used to get stickers on the light switches, turn it off. We didn't have the technology. Yes, I am showing my age significantly. We didn't have the technology that we now have with LEDs and PIR, infrared switches and so on. And I think with social media, there is a much greater emphasis. It's not just a built environment issue anymore, which is what low energy buildings really, certainly when Jeff Kundle was getting his slide rule out and his pencil to draw out the designs for Wansbeck, they really were, if you look at what he did there, the things were groundbreaking. They had a wind turbine on site, they had thermal store, they had an airtight membrane around that building, and they were delivering energy at 40 gigajoules per 100 cubic meters, which for those not in the healthcare market was the a number of years ago, the energy targets for new builds was between 35 and 55 gigajoules per 100 cubic metre, and they were delivering 40 well before that target. And I think I'm not quite sure what the target is, if I'm honest now. I've not heard any new targets lately, and whether that's coming out through the new guidance that Rosemary and Mike have touched on, or are we just going to rely on, let's call it building regulation compliance, and where that goes. Sorry, I'm getting some text from somebody. I've noticed that
sorry, Stephen, I was just going to interject really, is one of the things I think we need to also remember is we're not going to rebuild the whole of the NHS estate by 2030 or 2050, and that actually better using our existing hospital stock has got to be part of delivering to net zero carbon. Because I was always told that, in relation to sustainability, the most sustainable thing you can do is actually design a building that can change over time, can contract and expand, and take on new models of care and the like without physically changing that building. So I think whilst quite often there's a focus on the new builds and the health infrastructure plan, which is the HIP that's been referred to, we also need to spend time considering how we can better use our existing building stock. And part of that will, digital technology that will come to play in terms of the amount of physical environment that we actually need within the NHS to continue to deliver a sustainable service.
Can I just jump in there as well? I think you've hit on a really important aspect, which is there tends to be this attitude that you have to build new to get better. And we have some very good examples of buildings, and in some cases healthcare buildings that actually are quite old but actually outperform the new. So we do need to actually recognise that just because a building is old or of a different era doesn't necessarily mean it needs to be knocked down and started again, because invariably you're actually potentially adding more carbon into the atmosphere through the manufacturing process. So actually valuing and relifing existing buildings is actually really, really important.
And from an embodied...
Yeah, from an embodied carbon perspective, like one of the things that I suppose has caught a measure of interest here is, and it's come from the UK again, is the whole idea of the modular design. So actually stripping out a floor plate and actually putting in a prefabricated ward. So actually work with the building itself, actually prefabricate it, and actually have a really short downtime between how a hospital floor is empty to being ready to operate again. There's not enough work done on that.
And I think this is where Rosemary's looking at with the repeatable rooms. We don't use the word standard or nucleus related as we used to, but a repeatable room. And I think one of the things that we've always been struck on in developing healthcare, certainly in the UK, is the slavish sticking to the schedule of areas and making sure that we squeeze the last square metre. And Rosemary's done this plenty of times in working on projects. Whereas if you went for a slightly bigger building that was more flexible and adaptable, and if you actually look at what are the key drivers in a hospital, what's the specialisms, you've got an operating theatre which has got a unique set of criteria. You've got the scanners which have got unique sets of criteria, all different from environmental and structural and so on. But how much, if anybody actually sat and analysed, what are the elements that you could do in a commercial office? How much of the healthcare estate that we're building today could we do in a standard, basic environment? And I don't know if anybody's done that study.
Well, I think
there's actually...
sorry, I can say the Construction Innovation Hub and the Infrastructure Projects Authority are currently looking at, across the public sector, what's being sort of loosely termed platform design. And so that is something that's being developed currently, really aligned quite closely with standardization, which we are allowed to use and is a key term, to give us certainty and predictability. And that's not just around new build, that's around a kit of parts that could deliver within refurbishment and reconfigured existing estate. So certainly it's work that's being done. It never happens very quickly, I think, which is probably something that we're all struggling with. I think they've got a program of a couple of years to actually develop this across the different areas of public estate. So obviously sort of health and education are quite large factors in that. But I would say that, you know, modern methods of construction, standardization are absolutely fundamental in this. There's still, you know, in terms of reducing waste, there is still a lot of waste in both the design process, the consultation process, and the delivery on site, lacking innovation. So there's lots of progress that we can make through getting better standardization, and certainly on the repeatable room program under the P21 Plus and then the P22 programs, we were able to actually support greater innovation, because no longer were architects spending lots of time debating the minutiae of details within rooms that really didn't have an evidence base in terms of the benefit that they would then deliver. They were able to actually, that kit of parts is already agreed, they could move forward and look more widely at how they can deliver, you know, better patient flows and a real building to be proud of. So in that context, repeatability and standardization has actually supported innovation moving forward.
Stephen, I was just going to jump in there when you mentioned the idea of this whole flexibility, etc. There's an example here in Geelong, which is a city or just about 50k from Melbourne, and they've actually built during the COVID crisis an ICU floor on a vacant floor. They've done so with a rapid and ease of doing so because they had it planned. It's not being used because we haven't had the outbreaks that we have, but it's still seen as an example of how quickly things can be turned around. And it didn't happen because suddenly somebody thought about it. It was already planned in terms of that whole idea of thinking through how a space could be modified to be changed to allow it to actually change from one function to another.
I think we've had that in the UK with the Nightingales, that they went up incredibly quickly. We've got about 9-10 minutes to go. I think if we just have a look at some of the questions that we can try and tick off, if you don't mind. Someone said, is the NHS call for low carbon innovation still open? I don't know about that one. Does anyone know?
I don't think it ever closed.
That's good. Thank you.
I think if it's a good idea, they'll still like to hear about it.
Yeah.
Someone asked the question about where's it gone? We've talked obviously about new build, big build. We've mentioned the mega hospitals. If there's some quick wins that you've done at your level, James, at a trust level, that's enabled quick wins for you.
Within the operational estate rather than new build? There's so many. So we've touched on LED lighting there. So, you know, the NHS has a commitment to, in the operational planning guidance, all NHS trusts are required as part of maintenance, routine maintenance, to replace standard fittings with LED fittings. And, you know, I know Fiona Daly at NHSE and I managed to ring fence some money last year for trusts to bid for that, and so the potential there in the NHS estate is huge for LED lighting.
Somebody said, Jake Sullivan, with most NHS trust budgets already strained, is sufficient funding there to retrospectively install green technology in their poorly performing buildings in order to meet the zero carbon targets required? And that's one of the ones I was wondering, whether there's going to be a ring fence of money set aside to net zero carbon targets, much as you would have in a new build. You have an arts budget of, I think it's 1% or something. Is there any ring fencing of budgets coming forward, Mike? Are you aware of anything?
But well, no. I mean, it's bigger than that. As I said, I mean, the STU are working on whole economy changes, and the reality is that if you've got poorly performing stock, you'll look to, I mean, trying to retrofit a lot of things, you spend more money doing that than you would to build new, and you never get back to where you really need to be, because it starts back from your facade and your materials that you've used. I mean, the trend is that it's how those services are going to be re-provisioned across like more of a master planning aspect than a site development plan. So it may well be that if you've got a poor performing outpatients department, you move it to somewhere else, and you position it near to where the patients were. I mean, it's a whole. It's a move for integrated care and how you deliver it. So it starts at that level of analysing your services, and if you've then got services that are in poor stock, the stock goes. I mean, But you see, the thing is, we say about new is good. I mean, I sort of my first hospital was St Pancras and National Temperance in London. They were old sort of workhouse type hospitals with like 16'6" ceilings, terrazzo floors, but you had natural ventilation. You got about 6 air changes in the summertime from natural vent, and you could manage it. So they were actually sort of, and we ruined them when we modified them and improved them and put suspended ceilings and carpets in, and they were just too hot all the time then. So you need to think that sort of some things by design and sort of natural ways of sort of doing it are sometimes better, and you can't improve on it.
And I think if you go back to Florence Nightingale's Design for Hospitals, written in 1826, I think it covers things like ventilation, daylight, heat, and it's as valid today as it was when she wrote that guidance document. And if anyone wants to download it, it's easily. One thing that someone's put on here.
Steve, I was just going to say, I have to answer this one. There's Duncan Cox has basically said, "Is Cayman the crazy in the room in Australian projects? How do you respond to his inputs?" Actually, to be fair, I probably sometimes feel I am the crazy in the room because I tend to actually challenge things. As an EFD consultant, sometimes embarrassment is actually your strongest tool to get something to happen.
And I think
so you have to focus on actually forcing the conversation to be had and the challenge to be met. And
I think, James, you've probably felt the crazy in the room when you started on your drive at your trust, whereas now you've got a trust, an empowered trust board and an envisaged trust board to help you try and get there.
Yeah, that was the analogy I was using earlier. When we're in project meetings, that we're going to turn buildings into carbon carbuncles. It was. Thankfully, we didn't build that building, but my God, that would have been disappointing. So yeah, we're in a completely different place, and like I said, that was the unintended consequence. I just wanted them to understand the risks that we are. To our population, to our existence, I wanted them to feel a bit of the fear that I had so that they could understand why I was pushing for this. And that's certainly what's come across. So,
and I think you've got the paper from Stephen Lowndes in Health Estate Journal rather. You need to think of your roadmap. You've got an intermediate to short term, quick win, quick fix, a short to medium, and a medium to long term. And 30 years is a long time. It doesn't seem that far away, but if you look at the technology of where hydrogen's going, where carbon electric cars are, and so on, I think there's time to do it. If you don't just sit there and stand like a rabbit in the headlights and go, "Oh my God, how are we going to do this?" You just need to do what designers, consultants, clients do best, and just think and plan. Because if you don't plan, it's like the 3 Ps: poor planning prevents poor performance. I won't use the language. We've got a couple of minutes to go.
Stephen, I just pick up on that? Another thing that we found that when you focus on zero, it's you suddenly instead of like incremental changes, you're completely looking at different options. So if zero is your aspiration, you don't think, oh well, we'll save a little bit here and we'll switch that to that. You look at how you can actually achieve that. Now, heat we've talked about, and we can talk about forever about decarbonising heat is going to be very difficult. But as soon as you map that trajectory to zero, you might look at transition targets along the way. So you might actually want, for a new build, a gas-fired boiler that's going to be there for 10 years, but you have the space and the plant and the distribution at lower temperatures, so that when the new technology and the heat pumps improve for the size of the hospitals that we've got, that's what, we're working with designers. So if you're telling them where you want to get to, and that you don't want to lock in anything that's going to prevent you getting there, then all the innovation comes out. I've been in rooms with designers, architects and building services engineers who, once you've kind of convinced them of this as the vision, suddenly it opens up. They're like, wow, yeah, we could do this, we could do that.
We had to do that on Dulwich Community Hospital in South London, where we had to, part of the planning condition was to provide connectivity for a future district heat network that was still 2 or 3 kilometres down the road. We're coming close to the end now, and as I say, I know people have other meetings to attend to. We have got still 27 questions and 7 items on the chat room, and I hope when we turn the end button that these will stay live and Bianca will be able to collate them, and we'll hopefully seek some opinion from our panelists that we'll send around the delegates. Firstly,
just going to say on that question of heat, there's actually quite an interesting approach to that issue in China, in Hong Kong, and where they've got a district cooling system that's actually servicing the hospital.
Yes.
The first time it's actually done it. But they're using that process, reclaiming the waste heat and heat pumps to provide the heating, for heating hot water. And then they've got the largest solar collecting array on the roof of the building. And then because they haven't quite got there, there's a little bit of gas. So, I mean, as you say, once you actually open up your mind to something that's not been done before, it actually starts to just change the way you think. I think that's a really important step, is the fact that we do, even as designers and engineers, we get into the minutiae of things. We actually do need to learn to step back a bit more and actually look at it from a more holistic perspective, and something that you might find an idea actually opens up that you wouldn't have thought of.
And it's a fully integrated design team solution, you know, working alongside one another and respecting one another's drivers. We all have different elements of of a project to deliver. So I say we're 9 o'clock, and I know Rosemary has to shoot. So I just want to thank all our panelists for the time this morning, including the early start, which seems to be the norm these days moving forward. I want to thank our marketing team, Bianca and Johnny, for pulling this together, and Bianca having to deal with all the requests coming through. We've had just shy of 200 people at the peak. Duncan Cox, I think if it went well, I take the credit. If it didn't, it's Duncan's idea for coming up with it in the first place. Mike and James and Rosemary, thank you for your, and I think people have learned a lot in terms of people like myself thinking, what's happening? Where is the guidance coming from? We've been able to get that information today, and hopefully our collaborators on the call will take something away from that. And Cayman for staying up late in the office down in Melbourne. Hopefully you'll get home safe this evening.
I've got a nice cycle ahead of me, so it's fine.
I hope you have you're on compulsory face masks from tomorrow, is it, or tonight?
Yes, 11:59 tonight. If I happen to go outside, put the bin out, that's it. I'm going to have to have my mask on. So that's the way it's going to be.
Yeah,
but we'll get there. I mean, at the end of the day, it's just the necessary steps, unfortunately.
And I think one of the things is people say, you know, what's the post-COVID strategy? It's going to be around here for a while, so we may as well just, you know, do what we can. Look at these real challenges that we face as an industry in moving forward to net zero carbon, and just remember that we can't all do it tomorrow, but we can start tomorrow, and we can make some of those small incremental changes to the way we all behave in our working lives and cycling to work and so on. We will try and get to some of these answers in the next day or so. I think some of them we've possibly answered as we've chatted this morning. It keeps going up to 31. So some of them...
We've just got something to do with my glass of wine tonight, it's fine.
Well, that's well volunteered, Cayman. We'll pass them all to you then. And thank you very much for joining us. And for all those people who've joined this morning, thanks for taking the time out to join our panel.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye,
Thanks, everyone.
Cheers.